Section 4, Types of Derivatives. Here we will talk about the two major types of derivatives, which are forward commitments and contingent claims. We will say a little bit about hybrids, which is a combination of derivatives with other instruments, and then we will talk about derivatives underlyings. Let's start with forward commitments, and we will look at the definition first. Forward commitments are contracts entered into at one point in time that require both parties to engage in a transaction at a later point in time, and that is the expiration, on terms agreed upon at the start. The parties establish the identity and the quantity of the underlying, the manner in which the contract will be executed or settled when it expires, and the fixed price at which the underlying will be exchanged. This fixed price is called the forward price. The definition is long, but the idea is fairly straightforward. Let's say you have two parties, A and B. At time 0, parties A and B sign a contract which says that A will sell stock XYZ and B will buy stock XYZ at the end of 6 months. And this is similar to an example that I gave you earlier. That contract is a forward commitment because at time 0, both A and B are agreeing to do something in the future. Notice that they are agreeing on the underlying. The underlying is one stock of XYZ. The later point here is 6 months. The parties establish the identity and quantity of the underlying. Identity is this stock. Quantity in my example is 1. The manner in which the contract will be executed or settled when it expires. The contract will also say whether the selling party needs to physically deliver this particular item or whether the settlement here will be in cash. And this is something that we'll see in more detail later. The fixed price at which the underlying will be exchanged. This contract also needs to specify the fixed price. If that fixed price is 50, that means that A will sell for 50, B will buy for 50, regardless of what XYZ is worth over here. And again, this price is called a forward price. There are different types of forward commitments, and this is slightly confusing, but one type of a forward commitment is called a forward contract, another is called a futures contract, and a third is a swap. Each one of these has a reading unto itself later in the curriculum. A forward contract is one where the two parties create a customized contract. So two parties agree on the underlying, the quantity, and whatever terms they want to agree on, put those terms in this contract and sign the contract. So it is a customized private contract between two parties. But the major characteristic here is that both parties agree to do something at a later point in time. Futures contracts are similar except that they are exchange traded, so they are standardized. And swaps represent a series of cash flows which are exchanged, and we'll see this in more detail later. Let us now get into the different kinds of forward commitments in more detail. The first one that I just mentioned is a forward contract. And again, don't get confused. Forward commitments is the high-level term. Under forward commitments, we have forward contracts, futures, and swaps. Here we are talking about forward contracts. A forward contract is an over-the-counter derivative contract in which two parties agree that one party, the buyer, will purchase an underlying asset from the other party, the seller, at a later date at a fixed price which they agree on when the contract is signed. And the example that I just gave you applies here. Just to help you memorize this concept, I will show you that picture again. At time 0, two parties A and B sign a contract which says that at the end of month 6, A is going to sell and B is going to buy an underlying asset. So the underlying asset is one stock of XYZ. That underlying is specified over here. The expiration of the contract is specified. The forward price of 50 is specified. And how the contract will be settled is also specified. Those are the key pieces of information that are written in this contract. Obviously, there are other details also, but here is the core information. So this is a forward contract. Again, I want to emphasize some points over here. This is an over-the-counter derivative contract, which means it is between two parties. It is, in essence, private and customized. I have talked about this before, but want to emphasize this terminology, long and short. Let's say that in this contract, A will eventually sell. So A is getting into the contract to sell XYZ and B is getting into the contract to buy. The party that is getting into the contract to sell the underlying is called the short party, and one way to remember this is S for sell and S for short. Party B is getting into the contract to buy. This is the long party, and the silly way of remembering this is the party that is buying has deep pockets or long pockets, and that is the party which will buy. So long buy and short is the party that will sell. Notice that the forward price is set in the contract. No matter what the price of the underlying might be, this forward price is fixed. If the stock price ends up being above 50, so let's say this particular stock XYZ ends up at 60, then who gains? The long party gains. And just remember this, the long always gains if the underlying goes up. Why? Because the long is committing to buy for 50, the short is selling to sell for 50. If the underlying goes up, then the long is getting something that is worth 60 for only 50. So what is the payoff? If we look at different stock prices, the stock XYZ here is the underlying, then at a price of 50, if the stock price ends up at 50 at expiration, then the long does not gain and the short does not lose, because the long is paying 50 for an asset that is worth 50. What if the stock price is 60? Then the payoff or the gain to the long is 10. Why? Because the long will pay 50 for the underlying asset XYZ, and then the long can sell that same asset for 60 in the market, because the market price here is 60. If the market price is 70, then the gain to the long is 20. So notice that the payoff diagram looks like this. What if the stock price ends up at 40? Then the long still has to buy for 50. In the market, the long would sell for 40. So the loss here would be 10. So the payoff diagram is this 45-degree line which passes through 50, 50 being the forward price. What about the payoff for the short party? And I'll do this in a different color. So let's do the short party in blue. The payoff for the short party is going to be exactly the opposite. If the stock price is at 60, the short party makes a loss of 10 because the short party has to sell for 50 an underlying asset that is worth 60. Notice that the gain to the long is the same as the loss to the short. That's why derivatives are also called a zero-sum game. The gain to one party is equal to the loss to the other party. Futures contracts. Futures contracts also fall under the broader category of forward commitments. Let's look at the definition. A futures contract is a standardized derivative contract created and traded on a futures exchange in which two parties agree that one party, the buyer, will purchase an underlying asset from the other party, the seller, at a later date and at a price agreed on by the two parties when the contract is initiated, and in which there is a daily settling of gains and losses and a credit guarantee by the futures exchange through its clearinghouse. Again, this material will be covered in detail when we do the reading on futures contracts, but I want to emphasize the similarities and differences between futures and forwards, which is what you might be tested on over here. As with forwards, two parties agree at time 0 to conduct a transaction at some point in the future, and the two parties agree on a price. That price is called the futures price, generally denoted by small f. Forward prices are denoted by a capital or an uppercase F. But there are differences. Notice that I underlined standardized. Futures contracts are traded on exchanges, so they are exchange traded, and as we discussed earlier, the contracts are standardized. Everything is standardized except for the price. The price depends on the buyers and sellers. There is an underlying asset, so you might have a futures contract where the underlying is gold, for example. As with forward contracts, the agreement is to do something at a later date. The price agreed is the futures price. This is another important difference. There is a daily settlement of gains and losses. Let's say that you have two parties, A and B. A is the party that is selling, so A is the short party, B is the party that is buying the underlying or getting into the contract to buy, so B is long. If initially the futures price is set at 50 and then the price of gold goes up, who wins? The answer is that the long party benefits. Why? Because the long got into the contract to buy at a certain price. Now the underlying has gone up, so clearly the long benefits. Rather than wait till the end, what happens with futures contracts is that at the end of each trading day, the account of the long party is going to be credited. In other words, the appropriate amount of money will be added to the long party's account, and the party which is losing, the short party, will have a certain amount deducted from their account. When we do futures contracts later, we will go through detailed examples where we look at exactly how much money is added and subtracted at the end of every day. And since we will cover this material in detail later, I will not talk about it over here. The curriculum goes over several details, but I think that since you will cover this in the reading on futures, there is no point doing that same material over here. If you really want, you can do the reading on futures and then come back and read this section from the curriculum. Next we come to swaps, and swaps also fall under the larger category of forward commitments. A swap is an over-the-counter derivative contract in which two parties agree to exchange a series of cash flows whereby one party pays a variable series that will be determined by an underlying asset or rate, and the other party pays either a variable series determined by a different underlying asset or rate or a fixed series. I'll give you a very simple example and then you will see this in more detail in the reading on swaps. The simplest kind of swap is called a plain vanilla interest rate swap. Let's say we have two parties, A and B. If these two parties agree that A is going to pay a fixed rate of, let's say, 10% and B is going to pay a variable rate. Let's say that the variable rate is CIBOR, which is the Karachi Interbank Offer Rate. This is an example of a swap, but obviously more information needs to be specified. We need to specify the notional principal, which is the amount on which the actual interest payment will be calculated. If the notional principal is 100 million, this means that party B will pay a fixed rate of 10% of 100 million and party B will pay based on CIBOR. Obviously, in this particular swap, we also need to specify when payments must be made and how long the swap is in effect for. The total duration of the swap is called the tenor. This might be 3 years. Both parties might agree that payments are made every year. Then we would say that the payment is annual. Both parties could also agree that the payments will be quarterly. That really depends on the two parties. Notice that this is an over-the-counter contract, which means that it is customized per the requirements of A and B. That is all I will say over here because this is material that you will see in more detail later. We'll now go over questions from example 3 in the curriculum. Which of the following characterizes forward contracts and swaps but not futures? They are customized. Remember, both forward contracts and swaps were traded in over-the-counter markets. So they are customized. Futures are traded on exchanges and they are standardized. They are subject to daily price limits. I did not mention this, but this is something that is mentioned in the curriculum and something that you will see in detail later. We have daily price limits associated with futures contracts. Their payoffs are received on a daily basis. This is the daily settlement that I talked about with respect to futures. So the question is asking for the characteristics of forwards and swaps. The correct answer then is A. Which of the following distinguishes forwards from swaps? Forwards are over-the-counter instruments, whereas swaps are exchange-traded. This is not true. We just talked about the fact that swaps are also over-the-counter instruments. Forwards are regulated as futures, whereas swaps are regulated as securities. This makes no sense. Swaps have multiple payments, whereas forwards have only a single payment. This is correct. Remember, with my interest rate swap example, I said that the tenor is 3 years and the settlement was every year, which meant that multiple payments are being made. With a forward contract, only one payment is made at expiration. Next, which of the following occurs in the daily settlement of futures contracts? Initial margin deposits are refunded to the two parties. Gains and losses are reported to other market participants. Losses are charged to one party and gains are credited to the other. I did not cover this over here because you will see this material later, but since this has come up in a curriculum example, I'll just briefly mention a little bit more about futures contracts. With futures contracts, we have the exchange in the middle and two parties, the long and the short, which will interact with each other through the exchange. For a party to enter into a contract, it must post a certain amount of money. That is called the initial margin. So both parties, the long and the short, have to post an initial margin. That is really a initial deposit. You can think of it like a security bond, or you can think of it like a performance bond. So that money is not refunded. Therefore, option A is not correct. Gains and losses are reported to other market participants. That's not true. The gains and losses are known to each party, and if A gains, then A receives money. If B loses, then money is taken out of B's account. So this is not a true statement. Losses are charged to one party and gains credited to the other. This is a true statement. Therefore, C is the correct answer.